Welcome to the Deep Dive.
Hello.
Today we're tackling a figure whose name is, well, pretty much synonymous with political cunning, maybe even ruthlessness, Niccolò Machiavelli. Our mission really is to unpack his world and specifically his most famous and maybe most notorious work, The Prince.
And to do that, we're diving into the sources you've provided. We've got biographical stuff that really plants Machiavelli firmly in the chaotic soil of Renaissance Italy.
Right.
We've got direct bits from The Prince itself, those, revealing chapter titles, details from actual historical events he saw unfold, and even a look at his study of other leaders, like in his life of Castruccio Castracani.
Right, because the core of it is Machiavelli wasn't just writing theory in a vacuum. He was observing power as he saw it actually exercised, not how he wished it was.
Exactly. Offering this remarkably blunt, practical guide on how to get political power and, crucially, how to keep it.
Think of this as a bit of a shortcut, maybe. We're trying to cut through some of the layers of interpretation that have built up over centuries.
Yeah, get to the surprising facts and, let's be honest, the often uncomfortable insights from this hugely influential text.
So by the end of this deep dive, you should hopefully have a solid grasp of why The Prince has been debated, praised, and, well, condemned for centuries.
It really has.
Okay, let's set the scene a bit. To understand why Machiavelli wrote The Prince, you really have to understand the world he was living in.
Absolutely.
This was Florence, late 15th, early 16th centuries, a time of intense upheaval. Italy wasn't, unified.
No, not at all. A patchwork of city-states, always fighting.
Constantly fighting among themselves, facing invasions from France, from Spain, and these dramatic swings in their own governments, too.
And bouncing between republics and the rule of these powerful families like the Medici.
He grew up right in the middle of this. And while some people might have been swayed by figures like, say, Savonarola, the fiery preacher,
Right.
Machiavelli seemed more tuned into the practicalities of power. And his own career really shows the instability he saw all around him.
It does. From 1494 to 1512, he actually served the Free Florentine Republic in a pretty significant role, Chancellor and Secretary to the Ten of Liberty and Peace.
And this wasn't just a desk job, was it? He was a diplomat, sent on critical missions.
Yeah, he went to France to deal with King Louis XII, a king whose policies in Italy Machiavelli would later dissect pretty sharply in The Prince.
Ah, interesting.
He was sent to observe Cesare Borgia during those, infamous events at Sinigalia. He even dealt with Pope Julius II, who was quite the force.
So he was right there in the thick of it, seeing how power was brokered, how alliances shifted, how force was used.
He saw it all, but then, bam, 1512, the Republic falls, the Medici come back.
And Machiavelli loses his job.
Worse than that, he gets falsely accused of conspiracy, thrown in prison, and actually tortured.
Oof, that must have been a brutal turning point.
Absolutely, but it kind of forced him into what became his most productive period, from 1512 until he died, basically enforced retirement on his farm. He started writing.
And that's when The Prince emerges.
Exactly. Around 1513, he composed it quite quickly. He wrote really vividly about his evenings, taking off his muddy farm clothes, putting on his court robes.
Symbolic.
Very. And entering the ancient courts of the men of old by reading history, reading the classics. He felt, he said, entirely possessed by those great men, talking with them, asking them why they did what they did.
Wow. He said, he noted down what I have gained from their conversation and have composed a small work on principalities where I pour myself out as fully as I can in meditation on the subject.
Yeah, he called it a small gift, basically a distillation of everything he'd learned over so many years and with so many troubles and dangers.
It's important to remember, though, right? While he had all this practical experience, it wasn't like he was always successful.
Oh, definitely not. The sources mention he was sometimes misled, sometimes ignored by powerful figures, sometimes, a bit overawed.
But maybe that's the point. It was those real-world observations, the successes and failures, that grounded his analysis in The Prince.
Exactly. It made it a manual based on what actually happens, not just what should happen according to some ideal.
So let's dig into the book itself, The Prince. Machiavelli focuses very specifically on principality states, ruled by one prince.
Yep. He explicitly says he's leaving republics aside for now because he wrote about them elsewhere.
And his method is key here, isn't it? He wants to write something useful to him who apprehends it.
Right, meaning look at the real truth of how things work. Don't get lost in imagining ideal states that don't exist.
And this is where he drops that controversial bomb. a prince might need to know how to do wrong.
If the situation demands it. For the sake of the state.
He's really dissecting power dynamics, talks about different kinds of principalities, hereditary, mixed ones where you add territory.
And entirely new ones. And he quickly points out that getting and holding a new principality is way harder than just inheriting one.
Why is that?
Well, because when people support a change of ruler, they usually hope things will get better, right? But often, the new prince has to burden them. Maybe stationing soldiers, maybe new taxes to secure the place. So you instantly make enemies of those you've harmed.
And the friends who helped you get there?
They might be disappointed, you can't give them everything they want, or they might feel entitled. It's tricky. You can't always reward them sufficiently, but you can't crack down on them either, initially.
He looked at history, didn't he? Like the Romans expanding.
Yeah, to see what worked when holding on to new territories, especially if they were different language customs.
So the advice was?
Reside there yourself, if possible. That way you see problems brewing immediately and can fix them fast.
Makes sense.
Or send colonies. Cheaper than garrisoning troops everywhere. And colonists tend to be more loyal.
Okay.
And crucially, manage the local powers. Keep the strong ones down, befriend the weaker ones, and absolutely prevent powerful foreign players from getting a foothold.
He uses Louis XII of France as a kind of what not to do example, right?
Exactly. He critiques Louis's policy mistakes in Italy, arguing they actually weakened his own position in the long run. Machiavelli's point is, if you see trouble coming, you have to deal with it decisively, like catching a fever early before it takes hold.
Okay, so that's holding power. What about actually getting it? He talks about two main ways, right? Ability versus luck.
Pretty much. By your own ability, your virtue, as he calls it, or by fortune and using someone else's army.
And those who rise by their own ability.
He points to figures like Moses, Cyrus, Romulus, Theseus. Leaders who saw an opportunity and, this is key, had their own forces to impose new orders.
Because changing things is hard.
Immensely hard. Everyone who benefited from the old system is automatically against you.
And the people who might benefit from the new way.
They're hesitant, just lukewarm defenders, he calls them. Which is why, Machiavelli observes, unarmed prophets, people relying only on persuasion, like Savonarola, tend to fail. They lack the force to back up their vision.
Makes sense. Now, what about rising by fortune or using other people's armies?
Well, that's often faster, maybe easier initially, but holding on to that power is much, much harder. You're totally dependent on the luck and the strength of whoever put you there.
He contrasts Francesco Sforza, who became Duke of Milan through his own efforts.
Right, through virtue.
Yeah.
With Cesare Borgia, who's a really key figure for Machiavelli. Borgia rose mainly because of the fortune and power of his father, Pope Alexander VI.
And Borgia is this central kind of complex case study in The Prince, isn't he?
Absolutely central. Machiavelli actually holds him up as an example, someone to imitate if you rise by fortune. Even though Borgia ultimately failed due to just extraordinary bad luck,
Which was
getting gravely ill right when his father died, terrible timing.
Wow. So Machiavelli details how Cesare, starting with his dad's help, basically worked systematically to consolidate his power in central Italy.
Yeah, he moved away from relying on French troops or those fickle mercenaries. He started building his own army. Smart move.
And he undermined rival families like the Orsini and Colonnesi.
Strategically, yes. Gained their followers, weakened their base. Very methodical.
And this leads us to that really notorious example he uses, Sinigalia.
Ah, yes. Sinigalia. Cesare Borgia decided he needed to get rid of some rival captains who'd actually betrayed him earlier.
Oh, he invites them to a meeting.
Exactly. Vitellozzo Vitelli, Oliverato da Fermo, a guy who'd also risen through treachery, by the way, and others, invited them to Sinigalia, pretending it was all about reconciliation.
And they went.
They trusted him, or felt they had to go. Once they were inside, separated from their troops, Borgia gave a signal. They were seized immediately. That night, Vitellozzo and Oliverato were strangled.
Brutal.
Extremely. But Machiavelli uses it to illustrate Borgia's ruthlessness, yes, but also his ability to dissimulate, to put on a false face, to plan a deadly trap while appearing friendly. Politically, it was very effective in securing his position. Horrifying, but effective.
Machiavelli even quotes Borgia reflecting later, doesn't he? Saying he'd planned for everything that could happen when his father died.
Except for the fact that he himself might be near death at that exact moment. A stark reminder that even the best laid plans, the most ruthless actions, can be undone by sheer chance, by fortune.
So Cesare Borgia is the example of rising by fortune but using virtue to try and hold on. What about those who rise purely through, well, wickedness.
Right, he considers them too.
Mm-hmm.
Cites figures like Agathocles of Sicily and Oliverato da Fermo again, people who used extreme cruelty, treachery, killed their own citizens, betrayed friends, lacked any conventional morality to seize control.
But there's a subtle point here, isn't there? Machiavelli says that while these methods can get you an empire,
Yeah, he says it cannot be called talent or virtue in his specific sense, and it definitely won't win you glory.
so there's a difference between empire and glory.
For Machiavelli, yes. He contrasts Agathocles, who after his initial horrific acts actually showed courage and skill in defending his state later on, with Oliverato, whose cruelty just made him enemies and ultimately led to him being tricked and killed by Borgia. Cruelty alone wasn't enough.
Okay, what about the civil principality, where a leader comes to power through the favor of their fellow citizens?
Right, either backed by the ordinary people or by the nobles, the aristocracy. Machiavelli notes it's generally much easier to rule if you're brought to power by the people.
Why is that easier?
Because the nobles tend to see themselves as your equals. It's hard to command equals, right? They have their own ambitions. They might try to replace you.
Whereas the people?
The people generally just ask not to be oppressed. Their demands are simpler. So fearing hostile nobles is actually far more dangerous for a prince than fearing the people turning against him.
So if you were elevated by the nobles, what's Machiavelli's advice?
Simple and direct. You absolutely must win over the people. How?
Yeah.
Primarily by protecting them. Show them you're on their side against potential oppression, even from the nobles who backed you.
And he also warns against relying too much on, officials or magistrates to run things.
Yeah, especially in tough times. A wise prince makes sure his citizens feel a constant need for the state and for him personally. Direct loyalty is key.
Okay, let's shift to military stuff. Because for Machiavelli, this seems absolutely fundamental.
Non-negotiable, he states it flat out. The main foundations of any state are good laws and good arms.
And he connects them directly.
Directly. He argues you basically can't have good laws without good arms to enforce them and defend the state. Good arms lead to good laws.
And his view on mercenaries and auxiliaries, hired foreign troops.
Scathing. Absolutely scathing. He calls them useless and dangerous mercenaries. They're disunited, ambitious, have no loyalty. They're only in it for the pay.
Which is never enough, he says, to make them willing to die for you.
Exactly. They'll rob you blind in peacetime and run away or betray you in wartime.
He saw Italy's history as proof of this.
Completely. States relying on mercenary captains were weak, constantly being overrun by foreign powers like France and Spain. He describes their tactics designed to avoid fatigue and danger, not to win decisive battles.
And then auxiliaries. Troops borrowed from another power.
Even worse, in his view. Because if they lose, you're ruined along with them. But if they win...
You're basically their prisoner.
Precisely. You're dependent on them. They're now the strongest force in your own territory. He uses the example of Pope Julius II bringing in Spanish troops under Ferdinand. Risky business.
So the core takeaway here is rely on your own forces.
Absolutely. Your own subjects, your own citizens, people loyal to you, that's the only reliable military foundation. He praises Cesare Borgia, again, for realizing this and ditching the French auxiliaries and mercenaries to build his own army.
Relying on others' arms, he says, is like wearing armor that doesn't fit.
Yeah, it either falls off your back, weighs you down, or binds you fast. He points to France. Charles VII built a strong national army, but his successor, Louis XI, weakened it by bringing in Swiss mercenaries, making the French military dependent and ultimately less effective.
This strong emphasis on military strength then leads to another key piece of advice.
Right. A prince should have no other objective, no other thought, no other profession, basically, than war and its methods.
That's pretty extreme.
It sounds it, but for him, it was practical. That's how you keep the state you have and how you acquire new ones if needed. Constant vigilance, constant preparation.
How should a prince study war?
2 ways. Through action. Organizing troops, drilling them, knowing the terrain intimately. He even suggests hunting as good practice for that.
And the other way?
Through study, reading history, analyzing the campaigns of great commanders. He mentions Philopoemen, an ancient Greek leader who was supposedly always thinking about military tactics, even just walking in the countryside with friends. What if the enemy was here? That kind of thing.
Okay. Now we get to the real core of the controversy, right?
Mm-hmm.
The qualities a prince should actually have, or appear to have.
Mm-hmm. And again, Machiavelli isn't giving you a moral checklist to be a good person. He's giving you a list of qualities that make you an effective ruler who can hold on to power.
And he repeats that idea. A prince must learn how not to be good.
and know when to use that ability according to necessity. It's all about pragmatism for the state's survival.
He takes conventional virtues and flips them, like liberality, generosity.
Right. Being truly liberal, constantly giving things away, will likely bankrupt you. Then you have to tax your subjects heavily.
Which makes them hate you
Well,
or despise you for being wasteful.
Exactly. So he argues it's actually better to risk having a reputation for meanness, or maybe parsimony is a better word, being careful with resources.
Because that allows you to govern effectively.
Yes. It allows you to defend the state, undertake projects without overburdening the people. This perceived vice, he says, actually enables your rule.
Okay, then the big one. Cruelty versus clemency. Mercy versus fear.
This is probably his most famous, most shocking point. It's much safer to be feared than loved if you cannot manage to be both.
And his reasoning is?
Chillingly pragmatic. Men, he says, are generally ungrateful, fickle, liars, deceivers. They shun danger and are greedy for gain. Bonds of love are easily broken when it suits them.
But fear.
Fear is maintained by a dread of punishment, which, he says, never fails.
But, and this is a huge but, right? You must absolutely avoid being hated.
Crucial distinction. Fear is one thing. Hatred is disastrous. How do you avoid hatred? Simple rules. Don't take people's property. Don't take their women.
Property and women. The two big no-nos.
Seems so. And if you absolutely must execute someone, make sure you have a clear, manifest cause, a proper justification that people can see. Don't just seem arbitrary.
He puts it starkly. Men have less scruple in offending one who is beloved than one who is feared.
He does. And he brings back Cesare Borgia again. Not to say Borgia was a good guy, but to illustrate a political point.
About the Romagna.
Yes. Cesare sent in a ruthless lieutenant, Ramiro de Orco, to brutally establish order. Then, once order was restored and Ramiro was hated, Cesare had him publicly executed, cut in two in the piazza. Yeah. The effect. The people were simultaneously satisfied the hated governor was gone and stunned into obedience. Borgia appeared, in Machiavelli's analysis, much more merciful than the Florentine people, who, to avoid a reputation for cruelty, permitted Pistoia to be destroyed through factional violence. Borgia used cruelty strategically to deflect hatred and gain stability.
Wow, okay. And what about keeping promises? Keeping your word?
Conventionally, yeah, that's praiseworthy. Keep faith, be honest.
But Machiavelli observes?
He observes that the princes who have actually done great things often haven't worried too much about keeping faith. They've relied on cunning, on craftiness to get around men.
He uses that analogy, doesn't he? The beast and the man.
Right. A prince needs to know how to act like both. Use law when dealing with rational men, but use force like a beast when necessary. And the beast side needs two aspects.
The fox and the lion.
Exactly. Be cunning like a fox to recognize traps and snares, and be fierce like a lion to scare off the wolves, the threats.
So the really blunt takeaway is,
a wise ruler cannot, and frankly should not, keep his word when keeping it works against his interests, or when the reasons he made the promise no longer exist.
Why not?
Because, Machiavelli says bluntly, men are basically bad and they won't keep their word to you, so why should you be bound by it when it harms you? You'll always be able to find justifications for breaking your promise later.
But the key is appearance.
Absolutely critical. A prince should always appear to have all the good qualities: mercy, faithfulness, integrity, religious devotion, even if he doesn't actually practice them all the time. And he must be ready and able to act contrary to them when the needs of the state require it.
Because people judge by
appearances and results. If you win and maintain your state, the means will always be judged honorable. He points to Ferdinand of Aragon, King of Spain, as someone who masterfully used religion as a cloak for his ruthless expansionist policies.
Okay, so avoid being hated, avoid being despised. Property and women are key. What else leads to contempt?
Being seen as weak, indecisive, frivolous, effeminate, that's deadly. A prince needs to project strength, seriousness, resolution. If he's esteemed by his people and has strong defenses, conspiracies are much harder to pull off.
He liked the way the French kingdom was set up, didn't he, with the parliament?
Yeah, he saw it as a clever structure. The parliament could act as a check on the nobles and protect the people, taking some of the potential blame or resentment away from the king himself. The king could leave the unpopular tasks, the affairs of reproach to others, smart politics.
He also looked at Roman emperors who had that difficult balancing act between keeping the soldiers happy
That could overthrow them.
and keeping the people happy. who can riot.
Right. He notes that modern rulers, in his time anyway, maybe had it slightly easier because armies weren't quite the same kingmakers, but the core challenge of balancing different powerful groups and avoiding popular hatred remains. Emperor Severus is presented as someone who was good at being both the lion and the fox, feared and respected. His excessive cruelty eventually caught up with him, led to his assassination. So even that balance is precarious.
What about actual fortresses, castles? Are they a good idea?
Machiavelli's view is nuanced. It depends, he says. If you fear foreign enemies more than your own people, maybe build them.
But if you fear your own people more,
then don't build them, or even tear them down if they already exist, because they can become symbols of oppression and rallying points for rebellion.
The best fortress, he concludes,
is not being hated by your people.
Right.
Simple as that. He gives examples where rulers trusted in their stone walls but were overthrown because they'd lost the people's goodwill. A fortress is useless if everyone inside hates you.
How else does a prince gain renown, gain that positive reputation?
Through great actions, big enterprises. Like Ferdinand of Aragon conquering Granada that got attention, built prestige.
Also by setting memorable examples internally.
Yeah, rewarding or punishing people in a really striking public way so everyone talks about it, making a statement, like Messer Bernabo of Milan he mentions.
And being decisive in foreign policy.
Absolutely. Be a clear friend or a clear enemy. Never stay neutral. He argues neutrality just makes you pray for whoever wins the conflict. Taking a side, even if it's risky, is usually better in the long run. Win or lose, you gain something, either a share of the victory or a grateful ally if they lose but you stuck by them.
And encouraging the economy, arts, engaging with people.
Yes. Show you care about the prosperity of your state, encourage trade, agriculture, offer rewards, entertain the people sometimes with festivals, associate with guilds, but always maintain your dignity while doing so.
Okay, shifting gears slightly. Choosing advisors, hugely important, right?
Critical. Choosing good ministers, good secretaries, is a reflection of the prince's own judgment. He talks about 3 kinds of intellects. Those who understand things by themselves, the best. Those who can appreciate what others understand, good. And those who understand nothing, useless.
You want the first 2 types working for you?
Ideally, yes. And he praises Pandolfo Petrucci of Siena as someone who, if not brilliant himself, was smart enough to recognize and use smart advisors.
But then there's the danger of flatterers.
Oh, yeah, a huge danger. A prince needs truth, but too much unsolicited truth can lead to disrespect. How do you manage it?
His solution.
Make it clear that people won't offend you by telling the truth, but only about things you specifically ask them about. Choose a small group of trusted counselors, listen to their opinions honestly and separately, then make up your own mind and stick to it.
Don't let yourself be swayed by every opinion or flattering comment afterwards.
Exactly. Changing your mind constantly based on who spoke last makes you look weak and indecisive. That's ruinous.
And fundamentally, he says, good advice comes from
the prince's own wisdom. A wise prince will choose good advisors and manage them well. An unwise prince, even if surrounded by good advisors, won't know how to use them effectively. Wisdom has to start at the top.
He also comes back to the role of fortune, luck. What's his take?
He accepts its power. He concedes that maybe fortune governs half of everything that happens to us.
But the other half?
That's down to us, our free will, our preparation, our energy, our voltimont.
He uses that analogy of the river.
Yeah, a raging river. When it floods, it's destructive, uncontrollable. But in calm times, you can build defenses, dikes, canals, embankments to prepare for the flood, to channel it, to lessen its impact. You can't stop fortune, but you can prepare for it.
So success often depends on adapting your approach to the times.
Exactly. Sometimes caution is the right move, sometimes boldness is required. He gives Pope Julius II's surprise attack on Bologna as an example of impetuosity succeeding where caution might have failed.
And he ends that discussion with that famous, slightly problematic line.
Yeah, fortune is a woman, and like a woman, she is more often won over by the bold, the impetuous, those who treat her roughly than by those who proceed cautiously. It's a product of its time, that analogy, but the point is about seizing the initiative.
You know, after all that cold, hard analysis, the end of The Prince takes a surprising turn, doesn't it?
It really does. The final chapter is suddenly full of passion. It's an exhortation to liberate Italy from the barbarians, meaning the foreign invaders, the French, the Spanish.
He saw the state of Italy, at that time, oppressed, divided, leaderless, as actually presenting a perfect opportunity.
Exactly. The very depth of Italy's suffering, he argued, made it ripe for a great leader, a prince with virtue, to rise up and become a unifier, a liberator.
And he directs this appeal specifically to the Medici, to Lorenzo.
Yes. He tells Lorenzo that his family has the position, the ability, and the luck, fortuna, maybe even favored by God and the church, to take on this glorious task.
He argues the cause is just, the people are ready.
They just need leadership. And crucially, they need their own arms. He goes back to that theme. He laments that Italians might be strong individually in duels, but they fail in large battles. Why? Poor leadership and reliance on bad military systems, especially mercenaries.
So the absolute necessity is to raise and train native Italian forces.
Yes. To revive Italy's ancient valor and defend themselves against foreign domination. It's a really stirring call to action.
He even ends the whole book with a quote from Petrarch, doesn't he?
Yeah.
About Roman courage not being dead in Italian hearts.
Yeah, it leaves you on this note of maybe desperate hope.
We also looked briefly at his life of Castruccio Castracani, another study of a successful leader.
Right. Castruccio was a real military leader from Lucca back in the 14th century, known for his skill, his effectiveness, and again, a certain pragmatic ruthlessness.
And his life and sayings kind of echo the themes in The Prince.
They do. They provide another window into the kind of virtue Machiavelli admired. Like, Castruccio apparently believed it was the victory that brought the glory, not the methods of achieving it.
Ooh, that sounds familiar.
Doesn't it? And he also supposedly said that God is a lover of strong men because one always sees that the weak are chastised by the strong. It's that same focus on power, effectiveness, and results.
Looking back then, the sources really underline why The Prince still feels so relevant, right?
Absolutely. The problems Machiavelli was grappling with, the relationship between rulers and the ruled, the use of power versus morality, these are, in many ways, eternal political questions.
Governments today still rely on calculation, on force, not just on moral appeals.
Exactly. And his enduring value, maybe, comes from that unflinching description of people and states as they actually are, or at least as he saw them, stripped of all the idealistic wishful thinking.
So, to kind of wrap up this deep dive, Machiavelli wasn't necessarily saying cruelty and deceit are good things morally.
No, not inherently good. He was analyzing them as tools. Tools that a ruler operating in a dangerous, unpredictable world might need to use out of necessity to achieve a greater good, like stability, order, protecting the state. He judged actions by their political results.
It was that willingness to separate politics from conventional morality that was so shocking then.
And still is today, really. It earned him this reputation for being godless, immoral, the teacher of evil. And it remains challenging because it forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about how power often works.
Which maybe leaves us with a final thought for you, the listener. As you look around at politics, at leaders, at power dynamics in the world today, how much of Machiavelli's analysis, however chilling some of it might be, still feels, well, relevant?
And what does that tell us? About human nature, maybe? Or about the fundamental nature of power itself, something that hasn't really changed across the centuries? Something to think about.
Definitely something to think about.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive